Imagine standing in the middle of America. Look in every direction: forests, ranches, farmland, mountains, deserts, cities. America looks almost impossible to own. But here's the question most people rarely ask: who actually owns all this land? You might think the answer is simple. Farmers own farms, families own homes, companies own factories, the government owns national parks. But follow the land far enough, and the story becomes much stranger. Some of America's land belongs to ordinary families. Some belongs to corporations. Some belongs to billionaires who control millions of acres. Some belongs to foreign investors. And an enormous amount belongs to the American public through the federal government. So who really owns America? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before billionaires and corporations, North America was home to hundreds of indigenous nations. The land was not an empty frontier. People lived here, farmed here, hunted here, built communities here. But European colonization changed the meaning of land. Land increasingly became something that could be surveyed, claimed, sold, inherited, and turned into private property. After the United States was established, the federal government controlled enormous territories. Then came the Great American Land Expansion. Railroads received huge land grants. Settlers moved west. Farmers claimed land. Ranchers expanded. Mining companies searched for resources. Timber companies entered forests. Millions of acres changed hands. One of the most important laws was the Homestead Act of 1862. Under certain conditions, settlers could claim federal land, improve it, and eventually receive ownership. The goal was to create farms and communities, but it also helped transform enormous areas of public land into private property. And once land becomes private property, it can be bought, sold, inherited, combined, and concentrated. That history still shapes America today. So let's ask again, who owns American land? The first answer might surprise you. The federal government. The federal government owns roughly 640 million acres, around 28% of America's total land area. Much of it is concentrated in the western states and Alaska. These lands include forests, deserts, mountains, grazing areas, wildlife habitat, and national parks, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service. Together, they manage enormous parts of the American landscape. But public ownership doesn't mean unlimited public use. The government decides how these lands can be used. Some areas are protected, some allow grazing, some allow logging or mining. Some are preserved mainly for recreation and wildlife. So even when the public technically owns the land, the government controls its use. But federal land is only part of the story. The rest is largely private. And this is where things get fascinating. People often imagine American farmland as thousands of small family farms. But ownership is more complicated. The USDA reported that landlords rented out about 348 million acres of farmland in 2024, and approximately 79% of those rented acres were owned by non-farming landlords. That means a huge amount of farmland is owned by people or entities who aren't actually farming it. Some are individuals, some are families, some are trusts, some are corporations, and some are investors. Why? Because land isn't just dirt, it's an asset. It can produce crops, generate rent, support livestock, produce timber, and increase in value. Unlike stocks, land can't simply be created. Nobody can manufacture another Texas, or another Montana, or another California. There is a limited amount, and that makes ownership extremely valuable. Now comes one of the most surprising parts. America has private landowners who control millions of acres. According to the 2026 Land Report, Stan Kroenke is currently America's largest private landowner, with an estimated 2.7 million acres. The Emerson family controls roughly 2.44 million acres. John Malone is estimated at about 2.2 million acres. Ted Turner controls roughly 2 million acres. These numbers are difficult to imagine, One individual or family can control more land than some entire countries, but these properties aren't necessarily one enormous piece of land. They can be spread across several states. They may include ranches, forests, and agricultural properties, and ownership can serve different purposes: ranching, timber, conservation, investment, or simply preserving wealth. And that brings us to the real power of land. If you already own land, you own an asset that can generate more wealth. It can produce income. It can be rented. It can be inherited. It can be used as collateral. And that wealth can help you acquire even more land. So land can create a cycle. Land creates wealth. Wealth buys land. More land creates more wealth. And this is one reason ownership can become concentrated over generations. But what about foreigners? This is where the conversation becomes politically explosive. Foreign investors do own agricultural land in the United States. The USDA reported about 46 million acres of foreign-held U.S. agricultural land as of December 31st, 2024. That sounds enormous. But compared with America's total land area, it is a relatively small percentage. And foreign-held does not simply mean foreign governments own the land. It can involve foreign individuals, companies, and other entities. Some holdings also involve long-term leases rather than outright ownership. One country receives particular attention: China. Chinese-linked ownership of American agricultural land has become a major political controversy. But the broader picture is much larger. Foreign-held agricultural land comes from investors connected to many different countries. So when you hear foreign countries are buying America, the reality is more complicated. The bigger question is not only who owns the land, it's who controls it. A piece of farmland might belong to a corporation. That corporation could belong to another company. That company could have investors. A family trust might control the property. The person whose name appears in a headline may not be the only person benefiting from it. Modern land ownership can be surprisingly complicated. And that's why who owns America is such a difficult question. There isn't one giant list showing every acre and every ultimate owner. Ownership is divided among governments, families, farmers, corporations, trusts, institutions, investors, and millions of individuals. But ownership isn't the same thing as power. Imagine a farmer who owns 500 acres. The farmer owns the land. But its value depends on roads, water rights, taxes, commodity prices, markets, and government policies. Now, imagine a corporation controlling thousands of acres. Its influence can be much larger. And imagine the federal government controlling hundreds of millions of acres. That isn't private ownership, but it is enormous power over land use. So perhaps the real question isn't who owns America. Maybe it's who gets to decide what happens to America's land. Farmers make decisions about farms. Corporations control corporate properties. Local governments control zoning. States control huge areas of policy. The federal government controls public lands. And markets influence almost everything. Because land isn't just an investment, it is where people live, where food is grown, where water is stored, where forests survive, where wildlife moves, where cities expand, where energy is produced, and where communities are built. That's why land ownership is different from owning stocks or technology. When someone controls land, they control a physical place that other people may depend upon. And that creates difficult questions. Should billionaires be allowed to own millions of acres? Should corporations own enormous amounts of farmland? Should foreign ownership be restricted? Should more land remain publicly owned? Should farmland stay in family hands? There are no easy answers. Private ownership can encourage investment. Public ownership can protect landscapes. Large farms can increase efficiency. Small farms can preserve rural communities. Foreign investment can bring capital. But concentrated ownership can also create enormous economic power. And that brings us back to the mystery. America was built around the idea of private property. Yet the federal government still controls roughly 640 million acres. Millions of Americans own homes and farms. But some private families control millions of acres. Foreign investors hold tens of millions of acres of agricultural land, and corporations increasingly participate in the land market. So who really owns America? The answer is millions of people, governments, companies, families, and investors. But not equally. Some own a backyard, some own a farm, some own thousands of acres, and a few control millions. That's the paradox of American land. It looks endless, but every acre has a history. Someone lived there, someone fought for it, someone transferred it, someone bought it, someone inherited it, and someone controls what happens there today. So the next time you drive across America and see a massive ranch, a forest, a field, a desert, or an empty stretch of land, remember, it may look like nothing. But beneath the grass, soil, trees, and roads, there is a history, there is a deed, there is a chain of ownership, and behind that chain is one of the most powerful forces in American history: land. Because America may be called the land of opportunity, but the deeper question has always been, who gets to own the opportunity beneath their feet? So the question of who really owns American land has no simple answer. Millions of Americans own homes, farms, and businesses. The federal government controls hundreds of millions of acres. Wealthy families and private investors control enormous ranches and forests. Corporations and foreign investors also hold significant amounts of agricultural land. But beneath the numbers is a bigger story. American land has always meant more than property. It represents wealth, opportunity, power, and sometimes conflict. Land can be inherited. It can create wealth, and wealth can buy even more land. That is why ownership matters. Because unlike money, land cannot simply be created. Every acre has a history. Someone lived on it, someone claimed it, someone bought it, and someone controls it today. So the next time you look across America's endless landscape, remember, it may look like open space, but every acre belongs to someone. And perhaps the most important question isn't who owns America. It's this: who has the power to decide what happens to it?